Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mark Hers. I'm the local host of Morning Edition at GBH News. I'm today's moderator. In 2025, we know so much more about women's health than we did even 20 years ago. We now better understand how nutrition, genetics, and the environment influence the risk of developing illnesses such as heart disease, cancer, and diabetes. We can better differentiate women's and men's symptoms, risk factors, and disease development. And researchers are poised to discover more answers about women's health, including new understandings of memory, cognition, and healthy aging. So how did we get here, and where are we headed? Joining me today are four distinguished people connected to the long-running Nurses Health Study. They are Jorge Chavarro, Heather Eliason, Francine Laden, who are all professors at Harvard Chan School, and also we have Melissa Perez-Capitosto, Associate Professor at the Cannell School of Nursing at Boston College. So thank you all for being here to help us understand this. So for the uninitiated, what is the Nurses Health Study? How does it fit into the broader scope of women's health research?
Well, I can start with that, Mark. So initially, almost 50 years ago, the Nurses Health Study started sort of building on something called the British Doctor Study, which was the first study to look at smoking and how that related to lung cancer. And so our colleagues decided that there were lots of questions about oral contraceptive use and what the long-term consequences were, whether it was related to breast cancer. So building off of the design of the British Doctor Study, they initially thought that they could send questionnaires to doctors' wives. So they sent these out, and we received back a lot of questionnaires. And then they sent out a second questionnaire directly to the doctors' wives, and many of the wives wrote in saying, "I never saw the first questionnaire." So the doctors had answered it on their behalf. So they had a quick pivot to directly go to nurses. And what we've been able to do is collect information from hundreds of thousands of nurses over decades. So collecting information about their diet and exercise and medications that they use every 2 years. And then over time, in 100,000 women that we followed for decades, some people continue in good health, some people develop different diseases. So we've been able to use these data to be able to study the relationship between exposures that happen across the life course and health and disease outcomes.
And Jorge, did you want to enlarge upon that?
Yeah, so that's an excellent overview of where we started. Now there's a lot of what has happened in the last 49 years or so, right? So in addition to the original Nurses Health Study, which started in 1976, there are now three cohorts. There's the Nurses Health Study, Nurses Health Study 2, which started in 1989, with a slightly different focus. Now we're thinking more about nutrition and breast cancer, and more recently Nurses Health Study 3, which started in 2010, so we're celebrating our 15th year anniversary this year, where we again thinking about breast cancer, about thinking what's happening earlier in life. So it has a younger population, and because it has a younger population, there's been a lot more emphasis on pregnancy health and reproductive health in general of young women, of younger women. And there's other elements that are very important to the cohorts as a whole. They are supported by, the participants have been extremely generous in providing biological samples over the years that have been used for understanding biological factors associated with a variety of exposures and how these biological factors influence health and disease. And there's enormous diversity in many regards. Probably one of the most important is the fact that there's wherever there's people in the United States, there's a participant of the Nurses Health Study. So you can, if you were to map the geographic distribution of Nurses Health Study 3 participants, it pretty much matches the geographic distribution of people in the United States. And if anything, with an overrepresentation of rural areas, of areas where there's fewer people. So it allows for a fantastic opportunities to do research on pretty much anything you can imagine as far as women's health is concerned.
Well, let's hear about some of those things that you have imagined and that you fulfilled. Let's do a rapid fire of key discoveries in women's health that you all would like to note from this large and really important research. Why don't we start with Melissa?
Sure, I'll start. I'm a participant in the Nurses Health Study 3. I've been a participant since 2010, and when I was a very new nurse. And one thing that happened in the pandemic was we were getting surveys almost every week, which was excellent because they were trying to find out what our experience was like at the bedside when things were changing weekly, daily, in terms of how we were caring for people with COVID. So that was really exciting to me because I was able to participate in research that was making an impact in real time. And I just thought it was also kind of therapeutic. It was like, wow, someone's asking me what my clinic has or doesn't have. This is a really great opportunity to be able to share that with researchers who are going to do something good with it.
Francine?
Yeah, so one area that I'd just like to mention, as Jorge said, we have people living all over the country, and so one of the things that we're able to look at is where you live and how that affects your health. And we were one of the first studies in the United States to show that if you live in a greener area, you lived longer.
One highlight that I can offer is the impact of our studies on diet and health. So in particular, thinking about fat intake. So if you remember back to the 1990s, there was this whole craze about low-fat diets and that it was going to be helpful for heart disease and lower your breast cancer risk. And what we were able to do is show that, in fact, it's not the quantity of fat, but the quality of fat. And so one of the findings that I think is a key contribution from the Nurses Health Study is trans fat, and the fact that that was associated with a higher risk of heart disease. And part of the findings from our study helped provide evidence for the FDA to actually ban trans fat in 2018.
For me, my favorite findings from the Nurses Health Study over time are the things that become so obvious that nobody even thinks that they ever were an issue. So I think very, very high up in my list of favorite findings of the Nurses Health Study is that it was one of the first studies to show that smoking is bad for heart disease in women. When the Nurses Health Study started, there were pretty much all the evidence on smoking and heart disease was in men. So there were actually people who thought, well, it's actually not bad for women to smoke. It's okay. It's bad for men, but women are probably okay. And it was necessary for somebody to study women to figure out that no, it was just as harmful for men as it is for women. And just because you haven't seen it in women, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist in women, which is one of the reasons that this study is so important.
Mm. And let's look ahead. What excites you all most? What are the unanswered questions that you're hoping to tackle with this unmatched resource?
I'll start.
Go right ahead.
So, one of the reasons I got involved in the planning and design and launching Nurses Health Study 3 is that there was the opportunity of adding a completely new area of study that the nurses hadn't addressed, which is preconception and thinking about studying pregnancy before conception. So within the Nurses Health Study 3, we have been able to embed what amounts to a very, very large preconception cohort and pregnancy cohort. And we're now just starting to study and use that resource that is really unique, where it is extremely difficult to identify people who are trying to get pregnant. It's not something that people share freely unless they are in very, very specific settings. And in the Nurses Health Study 3, we have been able to build this very large resource that can be used to study both preconception, pregnancy, and health of children, thinking of intergenerational issues. So I'm very, very excited to be working a lot on that in the next decade or maybe longer. Yeah.
We'll just go on down the line.
Yeah, so I can think about sort of the other end of the life spectrum here in the aging aspect of the original Nurses Health Study and Nurses Health Study 2. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is trying to understand how do people survive after chronic disease diagnosis. So after somebody's had cancer, how how is it that some people are resilient and are able to live well after a diagnosis like that? And then also thinking about the healthy side of the spectrum, how do people achieve healthy longevity? And what can we learn about their lives and their lifestyles and exposures, in the aging period as well as in the earlier life periods, and how that impacts long and good health.
So I can kind of just add to that with the healthy aging is also questions about cognitive and brain health. As people age, there's definitely evidence of cognitive decline, and this is something that we're able to incorporate into the Nurses' Health studies. We're also using not just questionnaires that we are able to administer to people, but with telephone interviews, but also with wearables. And so there are opportunities with the wearables to get more momentary kinds of questions asked, and also leads into being able to look at where people are, how people are exercising, other aspects of that. So adding wearables to the basic questionnaire design has been a major advancement in the Nurses' Health studies.
Yeah. I'm like Jorge, very interested in preconception care and pregnancy and fertility awareness. So I love that the Nurses' Health Study 3 asks women, are you trying to get pregnant? Yes, no, or maybe. And capturing that maybe group and figuring out, what's going to switch them from maybe to yes, or from maybe to no, and what other factors are influenced in that decision. So I'm excited about that.
And maybe this is a Jorge question, I'm not sure, but just to follow on to this, if a researcher, maybe even a grad student, I don't know, has an idea and says, you have this repository of information and data, can they come to you with an idea? And
So the answer is of course.
okay, didn't want to assume.
The answer is of course. Both graduate students, colleagues at other institutions, So we receive somewhere in the neighborhood of about 300 requests per year, more or less. So we keep track of the requests from investigators of what are they asking us. The overwhelming majority of requests are like, sure, go ahead. And so usually the biggest barrier is actually finishing the project, right? Not getting started. Most of the time that we say, I'm sorry, we cannot help you, is because people imagine that we have more data than we have.
Oh.
So, and they said, oh, you surely have data on X, Y, and Z. I was like, nope, actually we don't. But for the most part, everybody who approaches us, we are in the capacity to say, yes, this is yes, and this is how. So on our website, there's instructions on how to do that. So so for the investigators that might be interested, whether they're graduate students or faculty or other interested parties, they're more than welcome to contact us. And one thing I forgot to say earlier, which Melissa reminded me, is we're still recruiting, right? Nurses' Health Studies. So if you're interested in participating, of course, you're also very much welcome to join. And the criteria are very loose. It was like, are you a nurse? And were you born on or after January 1st, 1965? So if those two things are true, you're probably you're most likely eligible to participate.
And you don't have to be a woman.
And you don't have to be just like you have to be a nurse. And as far as what counts as a nurse, it was like, if once a nurse, always a nurse. Even if you no longer work in nursing, you're still a nurse.
And let's dig a bit more into the mechanics of the research. Heather, what is the biorepository?
So we have had the amazing opportunity to collect from our nurse participants various biospecimens. So blood samples, urine samples, tumor tissue, stool for the microbiome. And all of those samples are stored in our biorepository. So we have large, what we call freezer farms, that include really big liquid nitrogen freezers that archive these biospecimens. So we've collected now from probably more than 70,000 women these samples that we've stored over time. And our collections are mostly done in mostly healthy women. And then what we can do is go back and measure their exposures before they actually developed disease to try to understand what are some things that we can measure and understand in their blood samples or in their urine samples that either may have contributed to developing disease or kept somebody healthy. And so we have ability to look at these more biologic levels of things. So we've used our biologic samples to validate the trans fat findings and associations with heart disease because we can measure that in blood samples. We've also measured things like estrogen in normal circulating estrogen in premenopausal women and in postmenopausal women to understand the relationship with breast cancer. And actually the premenopausal women, there's sort of an interesting, an amazing aspect of our collection in the Nurses' Health Study too. Many of the women were premenopausal at the time of blood collection. And as you know, hormones fluctuate across the menstrual cycle, so it becomes complicated. And our incredibly dedicated participants actually collected samples that were timed in their menstrual cycle. So early in their menstrual cycle, they collected a blood sample and then put it in their own freezer for 2 weeks. And then they collected another sample later in their menstrual cycle and then mailed those both back to us so that we have representation across the menstrual cycle to be able to study the fluctuation of hormones. So I mean, a lot of that just sort of underscores the unbelievable dedication of our participants to be able to contribute those.
So you're stewards of not just data, but samples, and is there a sell-by date on any of this, or is this going to go on for generations to be available and new researchers will come in with new questions?
I think for as long as we are able to operate, there will be a Nurses' Health Study. I mean, some of the resources are we continue to follow participants, right? So we're in the middle of active data collection in Nurses' Health Study 3. We're in the middle of about to launch a new round of data collection in Nurses and Nurses' Health Study 2. The biorepository is there, like as long as the liquid nitrogen bill can be paid, then their biorepository is still going to be there. The data that has been collected is there. So as long as we can continue paying for our computer storage charges, the data is still be there, right? So what has been collected, the resources that are there and are available for use. And I think as long as we can continue to be in contact with participants, which makes it very important to be able to engage with participants and make sure that we maintain a very close and positive relation with participants like Melissa, that we will continue asking them questions for as long as there's questions to ask.
And actually, Mark, if I could just add in terms of is there a sell-by date? Definitely not. And thinking about the biospecimens too, and over the length of time. So our first collection was in 1990. And in the 1990s, we could measure, if we took a quarter teaspoon of blood, we thought, well, this is such a small volume. We could measure one biomarker, like total cholesterol or something like that. And now, in something that's a tenth or a hundredth of that size, we can measure thousands of markers. So proteomics and metabolomics. And there's so many things, watching that technology develop over time, the samples continue to be these, treasure troves of potential information. And I just think there are lots of questions and technologies that haven't been asked and developed yet that will allow us to get more information out of those samples.
Well, this also raises the question for me, what is the difference between something like this that is so broad in so many ways? You describe various facets of diversity and involves such an incredible sample size. What's the difference between that and, and I'm a journalist, and, we're always reporting on studies with sample sizes that are just a tiny sliver compared to what you have. What is the difference?
Well, I would say there's many differences. One of them is, obviously the sample size allows you to ask questions that you wouldn't be able to ask in smaller studies, right? So we're able to ask much more specific questions about common things, as well as questions about rare things that smaller studies wouldn't be able to answer. Right? So that's one facet. One of the obvious facets is the size gives you statistical power that you wouldn't be able to have otherwise. But I would say another important facet that is independent of the statistics is that as a group, we're always trying to think about not only what are the scientific questions that we're interested in, but how do we future-proof? We spent an inordinate amount of time thinking about, okay, so what are the things that somebody might be interested in the future that we do not know yet, but that we can prepare for? And a lot of that happens with, for example, the biorepository, right? So for the biorepository, as Heather was describing earlier, I mean, we know the samples are there. We don't know what technologies are going to be there in 20 years or whatever, but if we don't collect it now, we will not have the opportunity to find out in 20 years. Same thing, we've embarked in major data collections that Francine mentioned earlier with cell phone data, right? So we have a couple thousand participants in Nurses Health Study 3 that have graciously allowed us to track them passively using their cell phones and using their wearables, right? So now we have terabytes and terabytes of data on lots of things of these participants, and we don't know exactly how we're going to use the data, right? But that's the point. The point is that now it's there. Somebody at some point is going to come up with an idea of how to use the data, and it's there.
It's like a scientific time capsule.
Exactly. Can I just add one
Yeah.
thing to that? Like, is that with the Nurses Health Study, because we've started collection and we're following people from when they're healthy, and they're basically representative of the general population, we can then do small studies. Some of these small studies that you might be seeing could actually be coming from the Nurses Health Study. But we do the small studies on the questions specific questions that we might have, and we know a lot about the person before they enrolled in the study, and that gives us a lot more ability to look at things, to be able to understand who they are when they're coming into the study and know that ahead of time. And we don't have the time issue of starting the study and then finding out the information, and so that leads to better science.
Right. What are even the smaller studies then higher quality studies because you can say rule out more confounding factors?
It gives us more ability to do that. I mean, I don't want to dish the other studies, but there's, we do have more ability to control for confounding and know that those variables happened before we started the study.
Yeah. I mean, nutrition was mentioned. That's a notorious area, I have to say. So to actually get a good nutrition study is really amazing.
Yeah.
And as a journalist, I'm curious, what's your advice to science reporters, and I have to add in social media influencers? I don't know if they're ready to take much advice, depending on who they are, about research. What are your concerns? The good, the bad, the ugly, whatever, yeah.
Well, I mean, this has been coming up so much in the news these days, and I think it's really emphasizing the nuance is really important, that there is a lot. Science and research is trying to figure out the answers. If we knew the answers ahead of time, we wouldn't need to do the research. And so sometimes we're going to have questions. It's not going to be a straightforward answer, but there's other state of the evidence, there's other scientists, there's other research that we can put together to come up with a story that makes sense.
Anybody else want to grab onto that?
Yeah, I would add, in terms of thinking about whenever we do research, the questions that we have, when I have a question, I analyze the data, write a paper to answer the question. It always spurs additional questions, right? So one single study may not be the be-all, end-all, but it's contributing to the body of evidence, as Francine said. And I think stepping back and trying to understand, the question of why does this study matter for women's health, and be able to help answer that in the context of everything else that we know, as well as acknowledging, what other questions it may raise too.
Right. If I may, so just playing devil's advocate on what we do wrong in communication, right? So I think there's a conflict on two different styles of communication, right? So as journalists, and I'm not a journalist, so please correct me if I'm wrong. It seems that the dynamic I see is like, okay, I want to get this one message across. There's this new study. I need to find somebody who is going to comment on this study. Oftentimes, it's going to be somebody who's going to say, "Well, I love it. They did everything great," or it's like, "Actually, no." This and the back and forth of they found this. but look at all the horrible things or all the things that they could have done better, gets better into the usual way in which press happens, right? Whereas science is more of an iterative process, right?
Yes.
And it's like, and so as a scientist, you're trying to go under this iterative process, and scientists are always not great at figuring out that when you're talking to the public, you're not talking to other scientists, right? So that you need to shift you need to realize that the way that you write a scientific paper or the way that you talk at a conference or the way that you talk to a colleague in the street or in the hallway uses a different communication style than when you're talking to the general public and when you're talking to a journalist, right? And like even when I was starting, it was like the most common mistakes was like you use all your technical language, right? So it was like nobody's going to understand all your hyper technical language unless you're part of your field. And if you start going that route, it gets very, very difficult for the journalists to get to the bottom line. So I think it's a situation where you guys have a tremendously difficult job of translating technical language to general public language, but we can also do more to help.
Yeah, and I would self-criticize us and say, when you say get to the bottom line, I think maybe we're too focused on that. That's what I hear you all saying is, I think we sometimes, well, we'll get the nuance in there, but what's the hot take? And, what do you know, what do you not know? Make it black and white. And what I hear you saying is it's not so black and white. And the fact that it's iterative almost seems sometimes in a clash with, what journalists think they need to be doing. So room for growth, for sure. And keeping with the theme of storytelling, I wanted to ask you all to share some stories from your careers. Francine, you were a grad student at Harvard in the 90s and now research how the environment influences women's health. Tell us about that journey.
Sure. So as has kind of come out already is that the Nurses' Health Study has been a training ground for generations of scientists. Jorge, Heather, and I all did our dissertation work and our graduate school work here with the Nurses' Health Study and now have become in principal investigators. My dissertation was on environmental risk factors in breast cancer. And I was looking at geographic variation in breast cancer, looking to see if where you lived in the United States if there was something environmental about different rates in the United States of breast cancer by where you lived, and seeing if I could control for risk factors, known risk factors, and understand if it was actually something in the environment. I also looked at pesticide exposures and breast cancer. But over the years, I've built a research program focusing on how the environment in general might affect multiple chronic diseases and health outcomes. So fertility, as well as a disease like heart disease or respiratory disease or even rheumatoid arthritis or other diseases like that. So we've used the residential histories from the participants who have been filling out questionnaires every 2 years for the original Nurses' Health Studies, and looked at where someone lives and taken those and used publicly available data on air pollution, on green space, on dioxin exposure, ultraviolet light, a whole slew of things, looking at the characteristics of the neighborhood and seeing how that's related to health. But one of the things I also wanted to talk about is that one of the most inspiring experiences of my career was the 20th anniversary celebration for the Nurses' Health Study, when we had a symposium, an in-person symposium, and down in downtown Boston, and we invited participants to come. And 800 participants came from all over the world to meet the researchers and to listen to talks about the research that they had contributed to. And this still sticks with me. It's, we're just going on to the 50th anniversary. This was 30 years ago. But it was just really exciting, and the energy in the room about these people who were so proud of what they had contributed to understanding women's health. And it just was pretty amazing.
I would love to build on that because I think some of my sort of personal connections and why it's important to not only do the research, but to build these resources and connections with the participants. So as Francine said, I had done my graduate training here as well, and I started as a master's student with data. These are data that other people had collected before I came here. And then you start getting into the data and you think, like, who contributed to this? And wow, like how did this get developed? And then now as a principal investigator of the nurses and nurses 2, you really get this understanding of the unbelievable dedication of these participants. The fact that they have answered thousands of questions over all of these years, contributed all these biologic samples. We're really learning from what their daily habits are and how that impacts health and disease. And it really is amazing. We'll get information, we'll get notes from nurses to say, like, I haven't gotten my questionnaire yet. When are you going to send it? And then, and actually during COVID, thinking about, so Melissa answers her questions online, but in the older cohorts, we still do paper questionnaires. And during COVID, we got paper questionnaires back, and some of the women would have written on the back, I did not lick the envelope, which I just loved. And so, and to Jorge's point about you have to have been a nurse at some point, many of the women in the original study were nurses early on and then, no longer were in nursing, but their dedication to this study and their identity as a participant in the Nurses' Health Study is really evident. So in our original cohort, approximately half the participants have passed away. And as we see their obituaries, it's actually mentioned in their obituary, their participation in the Nurses' Health Study. So it really has been this point of pride for them in terms of the contributions that they've made to help all of us understand women's health. And that's something that I think about that every day as I'm working with these incredible resources.
And we're lucky enough to have somebody who is a participant here. So let's turn to Melissa. You're both a research participant and a nurse scientist. So tell us about that intersection.
Yes. Okay. So I filled out my first Nurses' Health Study survey back in 2010, and I saw a flyer that said, "Nurses, this is your study." And I was working, and I didn't have a patient at that moment, so I had some time on my hands, and I said, "Why not?" Filling out a survey is as easy as like writing a Yelp review. They make it seem like we're very heroic. We're not. I can do it on the train. I can do it while I'm, scrolling on Instagram. It's so easy. I get my email. I log in to a very lovely dashboard, and it tells me what questionnaire I have available. And now I get them about twice a year. There are different opportunities to enter sub-studies based on interest, like a maternal health sub-study or the COVID sub-study that I was part of. But really, it is just so easy that I just kept doing it. Every time I would get an email, I would just fill out my survey. And I knew all the answers because they were about me, right? So I could tell them what I had for breakfast that day. So I had, at this time, I was 21 years old. I was in my first nursing job. I had no aspirations to be a nurse scientist or even a nurse practitioner someday. And, I ended up, going that route, and I was in my PhD program studying fertility awareness and the things that women did to track their menstrual cycle. And I was filling out my survey like I did, every summer. And I saw a question that was, if you're trying to get pregnant, how are you tracking your cycle? And I was like, oh my gosh, I need this. I want this. I need this. They have 50,000 participants. That's more than I'm going to get studying this myself. So I contacted the team through the website to be an external collaborator, and I submitted my proposal, and they accepted it because they wrote those questions and no one was doing anything with them. So they said, sure, Melissa, we'd love to have you, and it was wonderful. I ended up defending my dissertation using research from the Nurses' Health Study 3. Being a participant is something I am very proud of because in all of my hats, I probably identify most with nurse, and I'm very proud of being a nurse. So it just felt like very full circle, and I'm very excited to be with them today too.
Great. Well, we have I'm sorry. Does anyone else want to add anything? We have a few questions from the audience that we received online before the event, and these are open to anybody who feels that they're right in their wheelhouse. So for Megan, can you discuss how new research is suggesting that we treat symptoms of menopause in all stages, peri and post included?
So I can start with that and talk a little bit about the fact that, in the Nurses' Health Study, we had a wave of, women in the 90s in their postmenopausal years who were on hormone therapy for years and years and years. And then with the Women's Health Initiative trial, when that was published, women all of a sudden went off of their hormone therapy. And now we're sort of swinging back to the point of women are using hormone therapy, and there are many different forms of hormone therapy now too. It's not all oral. There are patches and vaginal estrogens that can help with symptoms. And so, women are using these now to treat symptoms over the shorter time period, but less likely to be on hormone therapy for many, many years. And
Right, and I think switching to the Nurses 3 end of things, so because we start with a younger cohort of participants, we are just starting to see some of the older participants starting to go into the years where we would start expecting some of them to start expecting perimenopausal symptoms. So we have been now for a few years starting to track menopausal symptoms in much more detail than we were able to do in Nurses' Health Study or Nurses' Health Study 2. So we're now we have now an opportunity to be able to track in much more detail what is the overall experience of transition, of the menopausal transition. And what I think is going to be very interesting from the Nurses' Health Study 3 data is that even the large landmark studies looking at menopause, like SWAN, the Study of Women Across the Nation, which is the study that essentially developed the definitions of what are the stages of menopause, right? So that's how important it's been. One of the advantages that we have over them is, one, size, we're much larger, and second, we are having people who are starting to answer in these questionnaires much, much earlier in life. So we will be able to have a much nuanced tracking of symptoms associated with menopause over a much, much longer period over a life course. And I'm sure there's going to be, as has been the case over and over again in the Nurses' Health Study, there's going to be more questions than we can even imagine right now that we are going to be able to study about menopause and women's experience of going through menopause.
Great. And here's another one from Hannah. How do you anticipate furthering women's health research with the current financial cuts? Are there coalitions working towards this?
so that is a great question. We are facing these challenges every day. And, I think what we've shown today is, there are still really interesting questions that need to be asked and answered and to understand women's health. So clearly it's a priority for us. And we're looking to try to diversify our financial support to be able to continue these studies. The resources that we've built can continue to serve to continue answering questions, as Jorge has talked about, too. Building the resources to answer questions of the future. These are continuing to be necessary things to fund and to support. So we're working hard to try to find ways to
Then if
diversify.
I may add to that. So one of the things Francine and I have been working a lot on this in the last few months, and I think two big top line issues have come up. One is, yes, we do need to diversify. We need to we need to start finding different sources of funding than what we have been used to. So that is the obvious part, right? The not so obvious part that we've also put a lot of effort into, is the fact that we need to rethink how we do our day-to-day operations, right? And that's one area where we're starting to work on, right? So just because we have always done things in the same way for nearly 50 years, it doesn't mean that we need to continue doing like our the nuts and bolts of getting questionnaires from participants to from idea to questionnaire to participants doesn't need to look identical in 2025 as it did in 1976. So how do we do that in a way that helps us to maintain the standard of scientific integrity and quality and try to do it at a lower cost is something that we're also looking into.
I think we also should add that we're prioritizing things that we don't want to lose the opportunity to do, such as making sure to continue recruiting people for the Nurses Health Study 3, making sure to continue sending out questionnaires, and because that we don't want to lose that opportunity to do that, because if we have a hole, then there's a hole. But the data are well stored. We're maintaining the biorepository. We're being very thoughtful about where we're putting our resources.
I like this real high altitude question. What capacity should we build to prepare for and address the challenges of an aging society?
Well, this is, aging and healthy aging is one of the areas where now, with women in the original study reaching the ages of 90 and 100, this is an opportunity for us to understand how are the aspects of life and life course and exposures across the life course influencing aging and healthy aging outcomes. And I think this is an area where there's still a lot of questions. How can we support people and advocate for choices and exposures that are going to benefit them to achieve healthy longevity? I think there are a lot of questions there.
And I'm sorry, I don't know if I mentioned that was from Iris.
And you're going to start seeing a pattern. I'm going to be pulling towards the earlier end of life. So on my own research that deals a lot with reproductive events throughout the life cycle, one of the things that we're starting noticing is that health outcomes in women during the menopausal transition, which is when you start seeing a rapid acceleration of adverse cardiometabolic outcomes. A lot of those may actually be related to ovarian health decades earlier. So how things like ovarian reserve or longitudinal patterns in ovarian function in your 20s or 30s may be just as important to what's going to be happening in your 50s as far as cardiovascular metabolic health, but we don't have a lot of data there, right? So again, one of the fantastic opportunities to understand longevity and aging as a society may also lie in understanding what's happening to women, what's happening to young women, and how is it that life course trajectories in health track from young adulthood into the rest of their lives.
And I think this is a great question to end with from Michelle. What course corrections do we need to take on current research on women's health? Is one area receiving too much attention with others receiving almost none?
Could start with that. I mean, first of all, can't think of anything right now that is receiving too much attention. We really need to think about women's health in general and overall. And one of the things that we have been really focusing on, and that we're able to do now that we were not in the past, was look at the whole continuum. We call this like looking at all different exposures that people are experiencing, along with their lifestyle factors. And really to how does that all integrate instead of looking at one thing at a time. So that's one thing that, because people don't just breathe air and not go, eat their vegetables. So they're doing both of those things at the same time. So I think that's something that we need to pay more attention to, is how these all work together.
Yeah, and I would build on that too, coming back to the blood samples, where it used to be that we would measure one marker, and now we can measure thousands, and we can put together these different panels of thousands of markers. So we can integrate what we know and understand about genomics with microbiome, with small metabolites that are circulating in the blood. So being able to integrate those and understand how these different areas intersect and impact on health. It provides more opportunities for us to answer some questions.
Anyone else?
So I was going to say, like, building on those two things, and that I think those two things exemplify why it is so important that we have these studies based at a school of public health as opposed to something else, which is that at a place like the Harvard School of Public Health, you have broad amount of expertise that can address issues like, okay, how does your metabolic health look over your life course, or how does vascular disease or autoimmune diseases. But we have the capacity of involving very high expertise on the biologic end of things. We have very high expertise on the quantitative aspects of that. That is a different set of skills, but we have them here. But we also have a very high degree of expertise on what are like the social aspects of these things, right? So one of the things that struck me from these questions, like, well, is there something that we're paying too much attention? I would say no, absolutely no. Like you, at the end of the day, I mean, women's health is about the health of each individual woman. And so you're not going to say, okay, I'm going to prioritize the health of my eyes over the health of, I don't know, my bones. You want to be healthy throughout your life course. So you cannot say that you're paying too much attention to something if ideally what you want to figure out is how do you optimize and how do you have the healthiest life possible throughout the life course. So no, we're not paying too much attention to anything. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for joining us today, and thank you all for helping us to understand more about the Nurses Health Study and women's health. This event will be available on demand at the Harvard T.H. Chan School YouTube channel. Have a great afternoon, everyone.